Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So our topic for tonight is exploring Islamic liberation theology. And liberation theology is originally a Christian terminology. And that's why there's Islamic liberation theology. And we're exploring it because by no means am I an expert in the field. But liberation theology was something that originated in the Roman Catholic Church in Latin America. We're going to get into that a little bit deeper, inshallah, to the history behind it. But realistically, it's focusing theology, focusing our faith, our aqidah in Arabic, on liberation of the oppressed, or the people who are the downtrodden or the disenfranchised. And so to get into the history of what liberation theology is, they usually reference in the late 60s and early 70s a priest named Gustavo Gutierrez. But realistically, it started way before the late 60s and 70s. Realistically, liberation theology started all the way back with the transatlantic slave trade. So now we have people who have been stolen from their houses and brought all the way across the world to a new land. And in this new land, they are obliged and forced to accept a new religion. Approximately between 15 and 30%, most scholars say about 25% of them were actually Muslim. Some of them had traditional or cultural African religions, and some of them were actually Christians as well. But by accepting the religion of the plantation owners and the slave owners, then this made life a little bit easier. But in that, they were already conscious of the racial difference. They were conscious of the state they were in. And that's something that is called black consciousness. They were conscious of the fact that there's a difference between them and their oppressors, and because of this difference, they are being affected of it. And they have no control in the outcome of this difference that is now making a difference in their life. So black consciousness started way back from the very beginning when the transatlantic slave trade first went off. And people broke into different religions. So again, you had the traditional and cultural African religions that were native to the lands that they came from. You had some Muslims, you had some Christians. But the athar, the connection to Islam, as most scholars, specifically Dr. Sherman Jackson mentions in his book, Islam in the Black America, was cut off. The connection between African Americans being Muslim today and African Americans that came over as slaves no longer actually exists. So when that happened, and there was a conversion of many of the blacks to Christianity, you have something now called black religion. And black consciousness started in the very beginning in the transatlantic slave trade, but black theology first started in the late 1800s, and some scholars say in the late 1700s. And this is when you had the development of the Freemason lodges. You had now Baptist churches that were specific, African American Baptist churches and Methodist churches that were specific to African Americans. And proof of this by scholars is that even in South Carolina, Georgia, and other places, there were actually laws stipulating the prohibition of people of color getting together at one place. So this proves that there are already ideologies and there was already theology starting to develop amongst African Americans in that time. And so with this theology now that was specific to people of color, they started to realize that there is a difference in the way that theology or religion is being taught by their oppressors or by people of European descent. And again, we're talking very early on, and sometimes even antebellum before the Civil War. And so around this time, stuff starts to progress. Black religion, or black theology, because there's a difference between black religion and black theology. Black theology starts to progress. And they start to focus now on the people who are poor, the people who are disenfranchised, the people who are now being affected by religion itself. Because why was Christianity pushed to be the prime religion not just because it was the religion of the slave owners, but also because it was the religion that was economically backed by slave owners. People justified Christianity, or they justified slave trade using Christianity, using different biblical passages that were perverted to justify slavery. And so not only was it convenient for slave owners to have their slaves convert to Christianity, but it also was economical as well. And so as things start to progress, when we start getting into the early 1900s, you have people starting to write, like W.E.B. Du Bois and other people writing about African Americans and the conditions that they're in, and and how they need to raise their awareness and raise their consciousness and change their theological perspectives, and how the Christianity of the slave owners or the oppressors was affecting their psyche. And so you have Carter G. Woodson, who wrote about different things, and you have Du Bois, who wrote about different things. And so they're starting to get authorship in scholarly works that are starting to be produced early on in the 1900s. And then you get closer into the 1965, I think it was, Board versus Education, in the very beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. And when the Civil Rights Movement starts, things are very, very different. Not only do you have people who they had black consciousness. They knew the difference between that their skin complexion made a difference in how they were immediately treated, and they also knew that they had no control over the outcomes of these things. And then you had black theology. You had a theological understanding of religion that directly affected or directly was interpreted through a black conscious lens. So they would take directly from historical references, of biblical references and other things to substantiate a now different perspective of religion. But when the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement starts, and I think it was around 65 or 68, now you have nonviolent protests that start. You have people who are now trying to make a change in what's actually going on in their environment. Not to say that people weren't before. We have Nat Turner, we have other people there have been numerous uprisings and revolts that happened throughout American history. But now we have it on a nationwide, on a collective level, the Civil Rights Movement and the nonviolent protests. So this is now when we start to see a different type of preaching that's going on from Christians. Christians are now preaching a focus on people of color. They're now focusing on African Americans and how they need to better themselves, and using theology focused directly on them, focusing directly on the disenfranchised. Now, this is in America, North America. Poor people and people affected directly from the transatlantic slave trade did not only affect America, it also affected Latin America and South America. Slaves went through all of this area. And very similarly, things were going on in Latin America. There's a progress, the same sort of progress happens, and it actually starts much earlier on. In the early 1800s, there was a revolt, and the slaves actually overtook the island of Haiti. And so this is happening very early on, but around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, stuff is starting to gain traction. And in Peru, you have Gustavo Gutierrez, who starts now to write directly as a minister, as a preacher in the Roman Catholic Church about a theology, a religious interpretation that is directly focused on the poor, that is directly focused on the disenfranchised, and now comes from a very, very different perspective. And this is different for two main reasons of his time. One, because now they're focusing on the poor people, which the church was not focusing on. They had traditional and norms that were taken directly from Europe that did not affect or did not benefit African slaves and people of color. But also, it was a direct challenge to the Roman Catholic Church, that now we can interpret religion on our own. We can now pull directly from historical context and apply this to our means in our situation. And this was very, very different. This was unprecedented for someone of the Roman Catholic Church or from the majority Christian community in South America to do something of this nature. And so this gains traction. It starts to go on to Uruguay. It goes on to different places in South America. But then, around the same time, so now we're talking about the early 70s, going into the early 80s, this also starts to affect disenfranchised people in South Africa, specifically the Muslims. Why is it affecting the Muslims? Because there as well, they have a very, even more complicated than we have here in America, racial dynamic. In South Africa, historically and even till today, you have 3 races, not 2 like we have here. Here we have white and black. There they also have another 3rd category of colored. Black are the traditionally people of African descent. Whites are people of European, specifically Dutch and British descent. And then colored people are a 3rd category of people of either Indian descent or Malaysian descent, primarily Muslims. So when the Dutch first came to South Africa in the early 1500s, they brought over Malaysians to be indentured servants. And with that, later on, Indians came over. And they started mixing together because they're both Muslims, they're both indentured servants. They're working together now to have a better environment for themselves. Actually, some of them mixed and they created their own ethnicity group called Cape Malay. It's very interesting. And so now they're a 3rd subcategory. And in the 80s, this continues on. They're in the apartheid. Nelson Mandela's incarcerated. And they want to start changing things. The government imposes laws that directly enforces the apartheid. The apartheid gets very much more intense. And now they are stuck in the middle somewhere. And because they're Muslim, the scholars of that time were trying to figure out how they can interpret all these things. Should the Muslims get involved with the black conscious and black African movements? Should they stay away from it? Should they start their own movements? And realistically, the youth said, it doesn't really matter to us. As typical for youth. They don't care what the scholars are saying. They directly get involved with the black conscious movement that's going on in South Africa in the early 80s. And they start to now become involved with these things, and then some of the scholars or some of the more academic people start to get involved in this new anti-apartheid movement. And with that, now there's a new demographic of people. There's now people who are writing very in the early 80s about the same things that are being written and talked about in North America and Latin America. Liberation theology. A religious perspective directly focusing on the poor, but now from an Islamic perspective. Now from an Islamic context. And as I said before, the more traditional scholars weren't touching these things for the most part. They were looking at things saying, we need to have our own way of doing things. A sort of old school traditional way of thinking. It's America, Islam versus the West, or America versus Muslims versus non-Muslim type thing. And the youth and these people who are activists get involved and say, no, we are directly a part of the society. We've been here since the early 1500s, some of them, and we're going to start doing things. So people now start writing about what liberation theology is, and they start defining it for themselves without of the scholars. And I want to put a special note on this because we're going to come back to it later. They start defining what liberation theology is, removed of the traditional scholars. And what they start doing is focusing on, in South Africa, an historical context. So taking from the early history that we have in our tradition as Muslims, whether it be prophets, or whether it be story of the Sahaba, or the earlier generations, directly pulling from these stories and focusing on 3 main categories. And these 3 main categories that they focus on in South Africa can be found in Latin America as well as in black consciousness and black theology. The 3 main categories are 1, spirituality, so on an individual level. In this, the Muslims, they wrote about this, calling it taqwa, obviously, from our perspective. The second main category of liberation theology they focused on was the ummah, the unity of the Muslim community. And in Latin America, they talked about the ummah the same way, or the community, and how they wanted to bring upliftment to disenfranchised. And the third category that they focused on was political, getting involved in what's going on, and trying to make change in policies and how things are going on. And so this is in the early 80s that we first see writings coming out of South Africa directly talking about liberation theology from an Islamic perspective. And so there's still people writing about it, it's still coming out, and people are still talking about African people or blacks in South Africa and writing about that. So my question is, how can we take liberation theology that people in the early 80s in apartheid South Africa were writing about and use it in our day and age today? Using these same focus points, but interpreting it through a lens that's productive, one, to our society, and two, goes back into tradition. Because when we're sort of excluding ourselves from tradition, excluding ourselves from the scholars, for whatever reason we may disagree or agree with them, then now we're pulling ourselves away from tradition a little bit. We're pulling ourselves away from the lineage of scholars that have tried to come through. And alhamdulillah, in our case in America, we have scholars that are directly involved with politics. We have Sheikh Omar Suleiman, Sheikh Yasser talks about things that are going on. We have scholars who we can turn back to that are talking about realistic things in our day and age, and it's not antiquated as they were having sort of in the apartheid South Africa. So how can we, again, use theology, use our aqidah, use our spirituality to be a means of upliftment to our society? How can we use it as a means to uplift us as individuals, to uplift our community, the ummah, and then also start to bring change? As I mentioned in the khutbah earlier, while they don't mention it in these three steps like this, liberation theologists, I think that there is a direct correlation to how and which ones we start with. We need to start with ourselves. Actually, I made a mistake in the khutbah earlier. I mentioned that Malcolm X saw his father die. He didn't, just a side note. A brother named Abdul Hakim pointed out, Jazakallah khair. So, if we're focusing on these three main categories, spirituality, unity as a community, and then getting involved socially and politically, what can we do? Because these same themes are very much relevant in our day and age today. These same themes, whether it's racism or prejudiceness or the forgottenness of the disenfranchised and the poor, is all going on today. And whether it's an apartheid in South Africa or it's racism in America, it's very much, or in antebellum America or early civil rights America, it's very relevant today. But what are we going to do as Muslims? How are we going to get involved? And I think first and foremost, we have to try to work on ourselves as individuals. We have to make sure that we are trying to uplift ourselves by being directly connected to a God consciousness, being directly connected to Allah via taqwa, which is God consciousness, so that we can now be a more proactive environment, a more proactive community. And by working on ourselves, then hopefully this will permeate into other pieces of our community. But in order to now focus on ourselves, we have to learn who Allah is. We have to take some action to further our understanding and awareness of Allah. This doesn't mean each and every one of us is going to become scholars. It doesn't mean we're all going to become now students of knowledge, but we need to have a base understanding. And then we have to have a determination to do these things. It is not possible that we're going to bring any change overnight through a light switch. And I'm going to go on a tangent here for a second. We are now accustomed in our society today to have instant gratification. We have microwaves, alhamdulillah. You want to warm up something, you stick it in 30 seconds, alhamdulillah, it comes out 30 seconds later. Whereas our parents or perhaps our grandparents, they had to cook a whole meal. They had to grind up spices. Alhamdulillah, we go to the store, international store, open the spice thing, throw it in we got biryani. Allahu Akbar. But it's very, very different. And this has affected how we are as a community. It has affected how we're used to things. We're used to instant gratification. As I was speaking to the class at Living Islam, I was telling them on Wednesday, I cannot plant. I will never be a gardener because it takes too daggone long. But if this is how we're thinking about our food, if this is how we're thinking about our families, our social lives, what about our spirituality? What about our religion? Do we expect that we're now going to drink some special tea, read a verse of Quran, and now, mashallah, tabarakallah, we're praying all of our prayers on time, we're always being muttaqi, we're fearful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or is it something that we're realistic and we understand this is a marathon, not a sprint? We understand this is a gradual thing that's going to happen. We're going to go down and we're going to go up. And so we have to break that cycle. We have to break the cycle of being able to just communicate with someone and get an answer immediately. If we see blue checks and we don't get a response and we get upset, this is not how our relation is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It requires us to put in the work. But if we put in the work, as the Prophet ﷺ said, if we go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala walking, He will come to us running. We have to strive. We have to now try to bring about change. And the second thing, after we've focused on our families, after we're trying to make sure that we are better as individuals, we have to make sure, as our early theologians in liberation theology focused on, the unity of the community and upliftment of the disenfranchised. And the two go hand in hand. We can't have unity as a community but forget about people who don't look like us or for whatever reason they're disenfranchised. The two have to go together because we have to all become uplifted as a community. Excuse me. As I mentioned earlier in the khutbah, this is what we have precedent for. This is what people who came before us did. And I'm not talking about the time of the Prophet ﷺ. I'm talking about 50 years ago, 60 years ago, the Black Panther Party, the Nation of Islam. These movements were able to be successful, regardless on their creedal and theological beliefs. We're not getting into that. But they were able to take people that were drug addicts and on the corner selling drugs and make them businessmen. Men who I've met myself, who are in their 70s and 80s, who still own businesses and are productive agents in society because of these earlier movements. So what were they able to do collectively to bring about a change that we aren't doing today? And that's by not forgetting anyone in our community. I would go on a limb to say if we remember and focus on the disenfranchised first, then everyone else will go up with them. If the people who are disenfranchised for whatever reason in our community, whether it's societal, whether it's economical, whether it's whatever reason, if we're able to bring them up, then everyone else is going to rise up with them. And so this is just a rhetorical or a hypothetical situation. I'm really a philosophical question, that I'm posing to you. What can we do as a community? What skills do we have that we can now give back to the community to help someone else? And it doesn't have to be some organized ISVC campaign. It doesn't have to be, mashallah, there's a brothers workout group that's like 3 or 4 days a week that all of the ISVC members go to. They keep telling me to come to. I'm not coming, stop. But they did that on their own. Yusufi goes, mashallah. And everyone from our community goes right across the street. It has no ISVC going on. And this is by one brother, Jazakallah khair, I won't put him out. One brother saying, let's get together and doing it. And this is the type of initiatives we need. I sat with a brother one day, and he told me he was a financial advisor. And I said, man, I'd love to talk to you about investing for my kids someday. He said, I love to too, and that was the end of our conversation. Wallahi, one day he came to the masjid and said, I just came to see you. I'd love to talk to you about financial planning for your future. That is what we need in our community. We need sincere people to use the skills they have to help uplift another person. I don't make enough money to save it all, so it doesn't matter. But that's not the point. He took out of his time before he went to work to now focus on someone like me, someone who we've only met once or twice, and just say, hey, I think I want to give back. And when I met with him a few weeks ago, not for financial planning or anything, he said, wallahi, I want to give back to the community, but we don't have enough people who actually want to receive it. So now this requires creating an environment where everyone feels comfortable communicating and working together. This requires an environment of trust and love and empathy and mercy, where now the people that are disenfranchised have no problem coming to the people who perhaps aren't and asking for help. Or we already have a situation where I don't need to tell you what I'm going through. You already know because we're brothers and sisters together. This is a community. This is how we are trying to be. But forget visiting each other. I've given up on that. We're never going to visit each other. That's not going to, unfortunately, due to our schedules and the way society is. But if we're just coming to the mission saying, Salaam alaikum, wa alaikum salam, have a nice day, it's superficial, then how are we ever going to create these bonds? How will I know what your brother's name, what your sister's name is, what you do for a living? It requires a healthy dose of curiosity. It requires us now just asking. It's okay to say, sister, what's your name? Be careful, brothers. I'm saying for sisters, talk to sisters. It's okay. But just asking, what do you do? I've never seen you before. Where are you from? What's going on? And also for the people who are new, as I had a sister do today, just say, hey, I'm new in the community. I love to meet somebody. We need both sides. We need people working together to create community. And again, this is how we can now focus on our community to build unity, to grow together. And it's all based in our theology. It's based in our creed. تعاونوا على البر والتقوى ولا تعاونوا على الإثم والعدوان, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran. Work together upon righteousness and piety, and do not work together upon evil and transgression. It's directly in our Quran. As Muslims, we should be doing this with one another. The hadith that I butchered earlier in the khutbah today, ليس منا من لم يوقر كبيرنا ويرحم ويوقر كبيرنا ويرحم صغيرنا أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. I butchered again. ليس منا, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, you're not from us, the one who doesn't have mercy on the elder, on the young, and have respect and endearment for the elders. It's directly involved in our theology from our beloved Prophet ﷺ, telling us how to conduct ourselves in a community. The question is, are we going to now embody these things? Are we going to now have mercy on our children when they run through the ranks? Do we want to smack them immediately, or do we pull them to the side, give them a hug, show them love, and tell them, Beta, you can't do that? Or with our elders, whether they're, or do we help them take their shoes off? Do we bring them water when they need the water? Do we ask them for advice and ask them for consultation on things that perhaps they have experience on? Or are they just these elderly people who get on our nerves and they come to the masjid and they take up ranks with their chairs? How do we look at our elders? Because how we look at things directly affects how we act in our life. If we're looking at things grudgingly, if we're looking at things from a very negative, pessimistic standpoint, then that will directly affect what we say and how we act and what we do. Again, our spiritual refinement is found directly, it's found deep in the subtleties. And it starts first and foremost with our mental and emotional state, what we're thinking about other people. First and foremost, what we're thinking about ourselves, that we think that we're so lofty that we deserve something, that we're entitled, someone should now give us something or show me respect because I am so-and-so. And then, what do we think of the other people? And the last and final thing is getting involved civically and politically. I don't even want to go there. One, because that is not my realm at all. I have no expertise and we have, mashallah, Neighbors for Neighbors. We have the one out of many campaign, the teachings that, mashallah, Yusuf and I forget the brother's name, forgive me, who came last week and told us about it. We have a lot of civic engagement going on that you can easily connect with someone to do that. But for me, I want us to focus on our community. I want us to focus on us as individuals, on our families, on our children, our babies, and then as a community, what are our relationships? How many of us have seen each other week in, week out, perhaps years, don't know each other's name? Okay, maybe you're not good with names. You have no information about them at all. They're just a brother you see at the masjid, or a sister you see at the masjid. You don't know what they do, what their background is, do they have kids, are they married, or they're not? These are the things that we have to be trying to establish as a community. Otherwise, yes, we have a lot of transient people in our community. Yes, we have young people that are in school or people who come for work for a period and they leave. But that shouldn't affect the core people who are coming here on a regular basis. That shouldn't affect the people who are always here. If you're here tonight, you're core because the other people didn't come. I'm not Imam Suhaib, alhamdulillah. So we need to start getting to know each other. Because I'm going to see you next week. You're going to see me next week, hopefully not up here. And we need to start building some connection with one another. If we don't, then what are we doing as a community? So, Jazakumullah khair. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.